The DJ had just cued the song for my father to walk me down the aisle when my sister Jessica stepped in front of him with a folder in her hand. And I remember thinking, in the half second before she opened her mouth, that the folder was the same soft blue color as the one our mother used to keep her recipes in. We were standing under the old oak arch at Hollow Creek Vineyard, 200 guests seated in white chairs facing a canopy dripping with the same peonies my mother had grown in her garden before she passed. And Jessica raised her voice loud enough that the string quartet actually stopped playing mid-measure. "Before this goes any further," she said, holding the folder up like evidence at a trial, "everyone here deserves to know that Crystal drained $42,000 out of Mom's estate trust to pay for this wedding, money that was supposed to be split 3 ways between me, her, and Dad." She said my name, Crystal, like it tasted bad in her mouth. She said she'd hired a forensic accountant of her own quietly over the past 2 months, someone who traced withdrawals from the trust account straight into vendor payments for the flowers, the caterer, the string quartet standing frozen behind her right now. All of it signed off with my signature as trustee. My hands were still holding my bouquet. Marcus, standing at the altar in his gray suit, took one step toward me and then stopped himself, because he didn't know yet whether stepping toward me would make things better or worse, and neither did I. Somewhere in the crowd, my Aunt Rosalind gasped loud enough to carry, and my father, sitting in the front row in the seat reserved for the father of the bride, put his face in his hands. And I understood in that moment that whatever this wedding had been supposed to be, it wasn't going to be that anymore. The photographer, a woman we'd hired specifically because she promised candid shots that told a real story, kept her camera raised out of pure instinct. And I would find out weeks later that she'd captured the entire thing. My face, Jessica's folder, the quartet's bows frozen midair, photographs I never asked to see and never will. My best friend Danny, standing beside me in a bridesmaid dress the color of sage, actually stepped between me and the folder, like she could physically block the accusation from reaching me, and Jessica just talked around her, louder, listing dollar figures like she'd rehearsed them 100 times in a mirror, which I would later learn she had. The officiant, a family friend who'd known both of us since we were children, tried gently to ask if we should pause the ceremony. And I remember hearing my own voice from somewhere far away saying, yes, we should pause, in a tone so calm, it frightened me more than screaming would have. Guests started standing in small clusters within minutes, some drifting toward the parking lot, others toward Jessica. A few, mostly my mother's oldest friends, drifting toward me instead, and I stood under that oak arch in my wedding dress for what felt like an hour. But the photographer's timestamps later showed was closer to 9 minutes, watching 200 people decide, in real time, which version of me they were willing to believe. Jessica and I grew up 2 years apart in the same house in Ohio, and for most of my childhood, she was the person I trusted most in the world, the one who taught me to ride a bike in the church parking lot, the one who sat up with me the whole night I had the flu in 6th grade, just so I wouldn't be scared alone. Something shifted around the time our mother's jewelry business, the small workshop she ran out of our garage making custom clasps and settings for local boutiques, started actually turning a profit, and our mother began teaching me the metalwork instead of Jessica. Not because she loved me more, she told me once, but because I was the one who kept coming back to the workbench on my own after school, while Jessica preferred her friends and her phone. Jessica never forgave that quietly made choice, even though our mother tried for years afterward to fold her into the business in other ways, offering her the bookkeeping, the client relationships, anything that would let her feel essential too. I remember one particular afternoon when I was maybe 15, watching Jessica sit at the workbench trying to learn the basic soldering technique our mother had taught me 2 years earlier, her hands shaking with frustration after the third failed attempt, and our mother gently suggesting she take a break and try the invoicing instead. A suggestion meant kindly that Jessica received like a verdict. Standing up so fast, she knocked over a tray of jump rings that scattered across the concrete floor and took us 20 minutes to fully recover. I remember our mother's 50th birthday, the year Jessica gave a toast that was supposed to be funny and instead spent 4 minutes listing every way I'd always been the favorite, laughing in a way that made the whole room laugh along, even though nobody in that room actually thought it was a joke. I remember 2 years before she died, our mother sitting me down separately from Jessica and telling me she was naming me sole trustee of the family trust. Not because she trusted me more as a person, she said, but because she'd watched me run a business ledger since I was 19, and she'd watched Jessica overdraw her checking account 4 times in 1 year, and trust needed a steady hand more than they needed fairness. I asked her to reconsider, to split the trusteeship, and she told me, in the gentle, stubborn way she said most important things, that fairness and wisdom weren't always the same decision, and she trusted me to make the wise one even when it wasn't the easy one. I remember, too, the summer I turned 25, and our mother asked me, almost apologetically, to redesign the workshop's entire clasp line because a boutique chain wanted to place a large order, and Jessica found out about the order before I told her myself, from a cousin at a barbecue, and didn't speak to me for 3 weeks afterward, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because she'd wanted, just once, to be the one with news worth sharing at a family gathering. And I remember the year Jessica tried starting her own small candle business and asked me not to help, specifically not to help, because she wanted to prove she could do something without me or mom involved. And when it folded after 8 months, I never once brought it up, though I noticed she brought it up herself, unprompted, at nearly every family dinner for the following 2 years, always framing it as a story about bad timing rather than anything else. What Jessica did not know, standing under that oak arch with her folder of withdrawal records, was that 4 years earlier I had filed a patent quietly, on my own time, for a magnetic clasp mechanism I designed in our mother's workshop, one that solved a problem jewelry makers had complained about for decades. Clasps that snap shut cleanly with one hand for people with arthritis or limited grip strength. I'd shown it to our mother before she got sick, and she'd cried at the workbench, actual tears, and told me it was the best thing to come out of that garage since she herself first opened it for business. 18 months before my wedding, a major accessories manufacturer called Halloway and Vance had licensed the patent for an amount that made my accountant read the contract twice before believing the number. A licensing deal I structured deliberately through a private holding company with a name that gave away nothing, because I knew Jessica well enough to know that any visible success of mine had a way of curdling into something between us, and I wanted, just once, to build something that was purely mine before the family found a way to make it about fairness again. I remember sitting in the patent attorney's office the day the filing finally went through, a cramped downtown space that smelled like old coffee, and feeling something close to guilt for not telling my own sister. Until I remembered the candle business and the barbecue, and the 15 years of small resentments stacked one on top of another. And I decided for once to let something be mine before it became a family conversation. The licensing negotiation itself had taken 4 months. My accountant and a patent lawyer sitting across from Holloway and Vance's legal team twice a week, structuring royalty percentages and manufacturing exclusivity terms I barely understood the first time they were explained to me, until eventually I understood every clause well enough to negotiate 2 points higher than their opening offer myself. The $42,000 Jessica was accusing me of stealing from the trust was real. It had come out of the trust account. But what her hired accountant either missed or chose not to mention was that I had wired an identical amount back into the trust from my own holding company 3 weeks earlier as reimbursement. A transaction sitting in the very same bank records she claimed to have combed through, because I'd always intended to cover the wedding costs myself, and simply hadn't finished the paperwork trail before she went digging. The 6 weeks between the wedding collapsing and the gala were the strangest of my adult life. A stretch of time where I still legally married Marcus at the courthouse on a Tuesday afternoon in jeans. Just the two of us and a clerk who had no idea what the week had cost us. Because we decided we weren't going to let Jessica also steal the legal part, whatever else she managed to take from us. My phone filled up with messages from relatives asking, in various tones of concern and accusation, whether the rumors were true, and I answered almost none of them, on the advice of the family attorney, which only fed the version of events where my silence looked like guilt rather than restraint. Two vendors quietly canceled contracts for future events once word reached them through the small local wedding industry grapevine. And one bridal boutique where I'd been a loyal customer for years sent a carefully worded email suggesting it might be best if I found alternative arrangements for any future business. Marcus went back to work at his engineering firm the Monday after the wedding, like nothing had happened, because someone needed to, and came home each night to find me at the kitchen table surrounded by bank statements and old family photographs, trying to reconstruct a paper trail I never should have needed to prove in the first place. Jessica organized what she called a family transparency meeting, timed deliberately for the same week as the annual gala for the Eleanor Bennett Foundation, the charity our mother had started to fund apprenticeships for young women in metalworking trades. An event where I sat on the board and where roughly 300 donors, foundation partners, and two local news crews would be gathered under one roof. Jessica had arranged, through a foundation board member she'd quietly cultivated a friendship with over the past year, to be given 5 minutes on stage before the keynote to address what she called a serious concern about financial mismanagement within the Bennett family's leadership of the trust that funded the foundation itself. She stood at the podium in a black dress our mother had actually helped her pick out years earlier for a different occasion entirely, and she told the room, calmly and with photocopies distributed to the first 3 rows, that the woman who sat on their board, and who they'd trusted to steward their mother's legacy, had been quietly siphoning money for personal use, and that donors deserved transparency before writing another check. A man from a foundation that had pledged $60,000 for the coming year actually stood up and asked, loudly, whether the gala should even continue while this was unresolved, and I watched 3 separate people at nearby tables quietly slide their unsigned pledge cards back into their purses. I was seated at the head table when it started, wearing a dress the color of my mother's favorite garnet, and I felt Marcus's hand find my knee under the tablecloth before I'd even fully processed what Jessica was saying. A steadying pressure that kept me from standing up too fast and proving, in front of two news cameras, exactly the kind of reactive guilt she was hoping to provoke. Warren Okafor, seated two chairs down from me, went very still, the particular stillness of a man doing math in his head about liability and optics, and 40 years of friendship with my mother all at once. And I watched him decide, in real time, not to interrupt yet, to let Jessica finish digging whatever hole she was digging before anyone tried to pull her out of it. In the middle of that gala, while Jessica was still building toward her closing point, my phone buzzed with a call from the memory care facility where our father had been living for the past year, his early onset dementia advancing faster than any of the doctors had predicted. And the nurse on the line told me he'd had a difficult afternoon, agitated and asking repeatedly for our mother, refusing to eat dinner until someone explained to him where she'd gone. I stepped out into the hotel's side corridor to take the call properly, and for 6 minutes, none of the accusations inside that ballroom mattered at all. There was only the sound of the nurse's calm voice describing redirection techniques and my own voice, quieter than I wanted it to be, asking her to please just sit with him a little longer until I could get there myself. The hallway smelled like banquet coffee and fresh carpet, and somewhere down the corridor, a hotel employee was wheeling a cart of dirty dishes toward the kitchen. The ordinary sounds of a building that had no idea it was hosting the second worst night of my year. Marcus found me leaning against the corridor wall, my makeup starting to give up on the day. And he didn't try to fix anything. He just stood with his shoulder against mine and let me breathe. He told me something then that I hadn't let myself think about since the wedding fell apart. That his own grandfather had lost a family hardware store to a business partner's forged signature decades earlier, and had spent the rest of his life bitter and loud about it. And that the bitterness had cost him more of his remaining years than the store itself ever had. Don't let this turn you into someone who needs to be right more than she needs to be happy, Marcus said. And I told him I wasn't sure yet which one I needed more tonight, and he said that was fair. My phone buzzed again while we stood there. A photo from the nurse this time. My father sitting in the facility's common room with a puzzle spread out in front of him. 100-piece picture of a lighthouse he'd been working on for a week, and the caption underneath just said, "He ate half a sandwich once we started the puzzle together. Thought you'd want to know he's calmer now." I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time since Jessica had stepped in front of that string quartet, and Danny found us a minute later, having slipped out of the ballroom herself, and she told me that inside, Warren Okafor had quietly asked Jessica to pause and let the keynote speaker begin as scheduled, buying me exactly the kind of time I hadn't known I needed. Danny had known my mother almost as well as Jessica had spent childhood summers at our house learning the same class mechanisms at the same workbench. And she said something I turned over in my head for weeks afterward, that she'd watched Jessica's resentment grow for 15 years, like a plant nobody ever pruned, and that no amount of evidence tonight was going to undo 15 years in one gala, but it might at least stop the plant from growing any further. Before we went back in, I called the facility one more time, just to hear the nurse confirm my father was settled for the night. And she put the phone near him for a moment, and even though he couldn't really talk on the phone anymore, I heard him hum a few bars of a song my mother used to sing in the workshop, an old habit that apparently survived even as so much else had started slipping away. And something about that hum steadied me more than any evidence file waiting on my laptop back inside the ballroom. We stood there another minute before I straightened my dress and told him it was time to go back in and finish what Jessica had started. So when I walked back into that ballroom, I didn't raise my voice. I asked the foundation's board chair, a longtime friend of my mother's named Warren Okafor, whether I might have 5 minutes as well. And before Jessica could object, a man near the back of the room stood up, someone I recognized instantly because his face had been on the cover of 3 trade magazines that year. David Halloway, co-founder of Halloway and Vance, the very manufacturer that had licensed my patent 18 months earlier, and quietly become one of the foundation's newest corporate sponsors, specifically because of my involvement on the board. Before Ms. Bennett responds, David said, his voice carrying easily across the ballroom without any need to raise it. I think it's worth the room knowing that the woman being accused of financial mismanagement here just closed one of the more disciplined licensing negotiations my legal team has handled in a decade. And frankly, the last person I'd expect to sloppily mishandle a family trust is someone who structured her own IP holdings with that much care. Jessica's face went through something complicated because she clearly had no idea who David Halloway was or why he was in that room at all. And for a moment, she looked from him to me and back again, trying to piece together how a stranger in an expensive suit knew more about my finances than she did after 2 months of digging. A murmur moved through the tables near the front. The particular kind of murmur that happens when a room full of people who make their living reading credibility suddenly recalibrates who has it. And I watched 2 board members lean toward each other, whispering, one of them mouthing the words IP holdings, like she was testing whether she'd heard correctly. Somewhere near the middle of the room, a man I didn't recognize leaned over to his table mate and asked, not quietly enough, whether anyone actually checked facts anymore before standing up at a podium with photocopies. And the table mate laughed in the particular way people laugh when they've just watched someone else's confidence collapse in real time. Warren Okafor, standing beside the podium, asked her directly whether she'd reviewed the full trust account history or only the withdrawal side of the ledger, a question that landed heavier than it sounded, because everyone in that room understood immediately what he was implying. I reviewed what my accountant gave me, Jessica said, and Warren said gently that perhaps that was worth sitting with for a moment. The idea that she'd built an entire public accusation on half a picture, handed to her by someone she'd paid to find exactly what she was already looking for. The 2 weeks after the wedding had been the hardest of my life, in a way that had nothing to do with the accusation itself. Mostly spent lying awake replaying the moment Jessica raised that folder, until Marcus finally sat me down at our kitchen table with a legal pad and told me that grief and shock had a shelf life, and mine was up, and it was time to start building something, instead of just absorbing what had been thrown at me. I called the security company that monitored our mother's old workshop the next morning, the same company she'd hired years earlier after a break-in scare, and asked for every log of building access going back 6 months, a request they fulfilled within 3 business days. And I remember sitting at that same kitchen table scrolling through timestamp after timestamp until one name appeared where it had no business appearing. I asked for the projector the gala staff had set up for the keynote presentation and pulled up a series of security stills, footage from the cameras installed at our mother's old workshop, the building where the trust's paper records had been stored in a locked file cabinet since her passing. Footage I'd requested from the security company 2 weeks after the wedding, Once Marcus convinced me to stop absorbing the accusation quietly and start actually looking for answers. The first still showed Jessica entering the workshop alone on a Tuesday afternoon in March, 4 months before the wedding, using a spare key she wasn't technically authorized to have anymore since I'd become sole trustee. Someone in the crowd, one of the foundation's longtime individual donors, asked how we could be sure this wasn't simply Jessica visiting a building she'd grown up in. A fair question asked without hostility. And I said that was exactly right, that alone the footage proved nothing, and moved to the second still, a timestamp showing her at the file cabinet for 11 minutes, considerably longer than any casual visit required. Jessica said she'd gone to look for old family photographs, and I said that was possible, and pulled up the third piece, a copy of the trust ledger page itself, the physical paper version, showing a photocopied signature block where my own signature had clearly been traced rather than written. The pen strokes too even, too careful. Nothing like the fast, messy signature I'd used my whole adult life. A forensic detail our own accountant, an actual licensed one this time, had flagged independently before I ever mentioned Jessica's visit to him. The fourth piece was the one that changed the room's temperature completely. A bank statement showing the wire transfer I had made from my holding company back into the trust account 3 weeks before the wedding. The exact $42,000 Jessica claimed I'd stolen, sitting in the very same account records her own hired accountant had reviewed and somehow never mentioned in his report. David Holloway, still standing near the back, said mildly that he'd be curious whether the forensic accountant Jessica hired had been given full access to the account history or a curated excerpt, a question that made the man Jessica had hired, sitting quietly at a table near the front, suddenly very interested in his phone. Warren Okafor asked Jessica directly, in front of the whole room, whether she'd like to explain the 11 minutes at the file cabinet, and Jessica said the workshop visit had nothing to do with any of it, that she'd simply wanted to feel close to our mother. Her voice cracking in a way that might have moved me 2 months earlier and now only made me tired. I pulled up the fifth piece, a text message Jessica had sent to the accountant the week before the wedding, one his firm's records had turned over voluntarily once his own certification came under review, where she wrote that she needed the numbers to look bad enough to stop the wedding, but not so bad it couldn't be walked back quietly afterward if it came to that. A message that made clear, in her own words, that the entire accusation had never been about protecting the trust at all. Jessica said, her voice thin now, that the message had been about protecting the family from a decision made too quickly, that she genuinely believed the wedding was a symptom of me rushing my whole life the way I always had. And I told her that whether or not she believed that, the message didn't say anything about a decision made too quickly. It said the numbers needed to look bad enough. Her own choice of words, not mine. I moved to a sixth and final piece, a voicemail Jessica had left for our Aunt Rosalind 2 weeks before the wedding. One Rosalind herself had brought to me quietly the week before the gala, after her own conscience got the better of her, in which Jessica said, almost gleefully, that once everyone saw the numbers, Crystal would have to postpone the wedding. And maybe, finally, people would stop treating her like the golden child. I played 11 seconds of that voicemail, no more, because 11 seconds was all it took for the room to hear exactly what this had always actually been about. A woman near the front, one of the foundation's largest annual donors, the one who'd stood up earlier threatening to pull her pledge, said loudly that she wanted her $60,000 commitment redirected specifically to the apprenticeship program I personally oversaw, effective immediately. And three other pledge cards that had been quietly slid back into purses came back out just as quietly. The apprentice whose scholarship I'd personally sponsored that year, a 19-year-old named Priyanka, who'd flown in from her second year of training specifically to speak at the keynote, found me afterward near the dessert table and told me, with the particular bluntness of someone young enough not to have learned to soften things yet, that watching me stay calm through all of it had taught her more about the trade than anything she'd learned at the bench so far, that Eleanor Bennett clearly built more than a workshop. She built a way of holding your ground without needing to shout. Jessica tried to say something about context, about how forensic accounting was complicated and easy to misread, and Warren Okafor cut her off, gently but firmly, saying that the board would need to discuss her own continued involvement with foundation events going forward, and that this conversation was better suited for a smaller room than 300 donors and two news cameras. One of the local news reporters in the back, a young woman who'd been filming quietly the entire time, later told me she'd almost packed up and left 20 minutes before David Halloway stood up, certain the gala had turned into just another family squabble not worth her editor's front page, and that watching the room flip so completely had reminded her why she'd wanted to be a reporter in the first place. To watch the truth actually catch up with the story instead of just documenting whichever version got there first. She lowered her camera and asked me, on the record, whether I had any comment before she filed her story that night, and I said only that my mother built this foundation to help young women build things that lasted, and I intended to keep doing exactly that. Nothing more, because I'd learned enough that week to know the story didn't need me to add anything else to it. The consequences arrived slowly over the following 2 months, the way consequences actually do. The Foundation's board voted 3 weeks later to formally remove Jessica from any future involvement with Foundation events, a decision Warren Okafor delivered to her personally rather than by letter, out of respect for what our mother would have wanted, even in a moment like this. The forensic accountant Jessica hired lost two other clients within a month, once word spread through the small local network of estate attorneys about the flagged methodology in his report. And his firm eventually issued a quiet correction, acknowledging the account history had been incomplete. The bank flagged Jessica's spare key access to the trust's safety deposit box for review once the forged signature was formally reported, and though no criminal charges were filed, largely because I asked the family attorney not to pursue that path, the trust's legal counsel required Jessica to sign a formal acknowledgement, removing any future claim to trustee authority. An outcome her own lawyer told her, apparently, was generous given what the paper trail actually showed. Jessica's employer, a regional accounting firm where she'd worked as an office manager for 6 years, quietly placed her on an internal review after the local paper's coverage of the gala, named her directly in connection with a forged signature, a review that ended 3 months later with a severance package and a mutual agreement that she'd pursue opportunities elsewhere. Jessica's husband, a quiet man named Peter, who'd always kept a respectful distance from family disputes, called me privately about a week after the story broke. Not to apologize on her behalf, he said, because that wasn't his to give, but to tell me he was moving out for a while, that he'd learned things about the voicemail and the file cabinet visit that he hadn't known before, and that he needed some space to figure out what he actually believed about the woman he'd married. The local paper's follow-up piece, written by the same reporter who'd lowered her camera at the gala, ran with a headline about foundation transparency that never once used the word fraud, out of caution, her editor told me later. But the piece was thorough enough that anyone reading it understood exactly what had happened without the paper needing to say it outright. Two cousins who had sided loudly with Jessica in the family group chat during the weeks after the wedding sent quiet apologies once the gala story broke in the local paper, one of them admitting she'd only ever heard Jessica's version of events and never thought to ask for mine. Aunt Rosalind, who had gasped so loudly at the original wedding, became, unexpectedly, one of my steadiest allies over those 2 months, driving me to visit my father twice a week when Marcus couldn't, and telling me once over coffee that she'd always suspected Jessica's version of events was thinner than it sounded. She just hadn't had the courage to say so out loud until the voicemail made it impossible to stay quiet any longer. And my father, in one of his clearer afternoons at the facility, the kind that came less and less often that year, held my hand and told me he was sorry he hadn't stood up faster at the wedding, that some part of him had frozen out of confusion rather than doubt, and that he'd always known, even in the moments his memory failed him about everything else, that I was the daughter who kept coming back to the workbench. Jessica called me 2 months after the gala, her voice smaller than I'd ever heard it, and asked if we could meet at the old workshop, just the two of us. I almost said no. I sat with the phone in my hand for a full minute after she asked, thinking about the voicemail, the 11 minutes at the file cabinet, the 6 weeks I'd spent explaining myself to relatives who should have known better than to need an explanation at all. And then I thought about the girl who taught me to ride a bike in that church parking lot. And I said yes, mostly, I think, for our mother's sake. She stood near the same file cabinet the security footage had caught her at, thinner than I remembered, her hands wrapped around a mug of tea she never drank from, an echo I didn't mention out loud. She said she was sorry, that watching Mom choose me for the business all those years ago had planted something in her she never learned how to dig out, that every year I built something new only reopened a wound she'd never told anyone, not even her own husband, that she was carrying, that somewhere along the way, the resentment had stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like the only language she had left for loving me. She said she understood if I never wanted to speak to her again, but she was asking anyway, because losing my trust felt like losing our mother twice. I let her finish. I told her I'd spent a long time in that hotel corridor during the gala, deciding what kind of sister I wanted to be on the other side of this. And the answer wasn't cruelty, but it also wasn't forgetting. I hope you find whatever peace you're actually looking for, Jessica, I said. But Mom gave you every chance to build something of your own for 20 years, and you spent this year trying to burn down what I built instead. I'm not interested in pretending that didn't happen. She nodded like she'd expected exactly that answer. And she left through the same door our mother used to prop open with a brick during the summer months. And I stood in that workshop a long while after she was gone, not triumphant, just tired in the particular way that comes after finally putting something heavy down. Marcus and I finally had the wedding we'd planned, 6 months later than intended, in the same vineyard under the same oak arch, this time with a much smaller guest list. No string quartet because I couldn't hear one without thinking of bows freezing mid-measure, and my father seated in the front row in a wheelchair, his good days growing rarer. But this one, mercifully, one of them, clear enough that he squeezed my hand through the entire ceremony and told me afterward, in a voice steady enough to carry, that I looked exactly like my mother had on her own wedding day, a photograph he still kept by his bed. Danny stood beside me again, and this time nothing interrupted the music. And when Marcus and I finally kissed at the end of the aisle, I caught my father clapping along with everyone else, slightly delayed, following the rhythm of the crowd the way he'd started needing to that year. And it was somehow the most beautiful thing I saw all day. Aunt Rosalind gave a toast instead of Jessica, short and unpolished, and full of stories about my mother's workshop. And halfway through it, my father said, loudly enough for the nearby tables to hear, "That's my Eleanor's girl," using my mother's name instead of mine. And nobody corrected him, because in some way that felt truer than anything else said that day. David Halloway sent flowers that arrived the morning of the ceremony. No card beyond a short handwritten note wishing us well and mentioning that his own daughter's wedding was coming up in the spring. A small gesture from a man who'd had no real reason to involve himself in any of this, beyond deciding that night at the gala that the truth was worth standing up for. Priyanka came too, seated near the back with two other apprentices, and found me during the reception to say that she'd started keeping a small notebook of things she wanted to remember from watching me that year. And the first entry, she told me, was simply the word steady. What I didn't know, standing at that second altar, was that it would be the last truly good day he had. That 3 weeks later, his decline would accelerate the way the doctors had always warned it eventually would, and that by the time autumn came, he no longer recognized me most afternoons, though something in him still softened whenever I brought jewelry pieces from the workshop for him to hold, his fingers tracing the clasps, like his hands remembered, even after his mind stopped trying. I sat with him some afternoons and just worked on small repairs at his bedside. The sound of the tools apparently reaching some part of him a language no longer could. And a nurse told me once that his heart rate visibly settled every time I brought the toolkit in. Like his body still recognized the workshop even after his mind had let go of most everything else. I think about that sometimes, that I won every version of the fight that mattered, cleared my name in front of 300 people, kept the foundation my mother built, kept the business that was purely mine, and still lost the version of my father who could fully understand any of it. The cost of the year arriving quietly after all the loud parts were already over. The workshop is still standing, still smells like flux and beeswax on humid days, and I still go in most Saturdays, even though the business has long since outgrown that garage, because some part of me needs to keep working with my hands in the same room where all of this actually started, long before any folder or any gala or any wire transfer. Back when it was just my mother and me and a workbench and a problem worth solving. Crystal Bennett Designs, the name I finally put on the business a year after the gala, now employs 6 people out of a proper studio space 2 miles from that original garage, though the garage itself still holds the original workbench, unmoved, unrenovated, exactly where my mother left it. I think about that oak arch a lot, The one where a folder full of half-true numbers almost stole my wedding day. And the one where 6 months later, I stood under it again with the truth finally settled and my father's hand in mine for what turned out to be one of our last clear conversations. If you've ever had someone you loved rewrite your own story in front of a room full of people who should have known better, you already know that winning the argument and getting back everything you lost are two very different kinds of victory. And sometimes you only get the first one. So let me ask you something before you go. If proving the truth cost you something you couldn't get back either way, would you still choose to prove it? Tell me in the comments. And if the story felt like it was worth your time tonight, hit like and subscribe so the next one finds you too.